Hi, folks. Another week goes by. What's going on out there? Anybody have any ideas? Your guess is as good as mine, and probably better than half the pundits we see on TV these days. So we're doing all kinds of interesting things in the world, aren't we? I thought we should talk about some of them. A couple of them are kind of interesting, just from a historical standpoint, and that is that we are putting some Marines into the Straits of Hormuz. I think I read about 5,000 the other day. And if you ask me, and I know I'm biased, but anybody can settle a hash in the Middle East, it's the Marines. But you have to have kind of a better idea of the mission. And not a criticism, really, but I'm not 100% certain where we're all going here. I know what we'd like to see, but if you listen to some of the various takes on what's going on by people that actually might know a little something or understand these types of things, see, a lot of times when you're watching pundits on TV, they're just commenting about something that just happened, and they make vague references to stuff that's going on, and you kind of, what's that about? What do you mean? What is that about? But it never really gets explained. So that's why in this show, we try and go into some of these other areas that need to be explained, at least I think so that you have a little context on them and see what they're referring to. Also, I have to say that the media, and I'm going to throw Fox in on this, just maybe as much as anybody, they tend to go out and grab people as experts that I'm not exactly sure their expertise lies in what they're asking them. We have a lot of situations where there's criminal activity going on. There's terrible events with the shooting of this ROTC commander and all these kinds of things. And Fox will sometimes go out and grab some retired FBI person who may or may not have any ideas about this stuff because that's not what they did. You know, the FBI, for the most part, isn't out chasing criminals like police. We know, of course, that one of their main jobs is, of course, tracking down mysterious things, primarily UFOs, if you watch the X-Files. But really, a lot of their work, and it's very good work, is done as really crimes, paper crimes, fraud against the government, embezzlements, things like that involve governmental action. Now, they also, of course, obviously have a lot to do with hunting down criminal activity. Mainly the FBI got involved in this over the years because of their laboratory analysis, not because they were the greatest sleuths in the world, per se, but because they had developed laboratory analytical skills and places, particularly in Quantico, Virginia, that other places just frankly couldn't replicate. So a lot of evidence is sent to their laboratories, and that includes chemical as well as electronic and all kinds of stuff now, for them to analyze it and come up with something. It doesn't mean that the agents themselves, per se, are any better than a lot of the police or sheriffs or people of that nature. And if you do watch Fox and you see Paul Morrow, who was a former inspector for a number of years in the NYPD and has a background in counterterrorism and a few things like that, who's now an attorney and just really a smart guy, very well spoken, and has a lot of experience, very grounded. I like listening to him, just like I listen to the General Jack Keane, also on Fox, as the military. But a lot of times they pull people in and you wonder, okay, so they worked for the CIA. What exactly was their job there? I don't think they were traveling the world hiding microfilm in their belly buttons. I think there's a lot of them that are studying newspapers. Analysts are what a lot of the people at the CIA do. And it's very valuable work because they analyze news stories, information, and obviously we have all sorts of electronic intercepts and just plain eye in the sky stuff that they work on. it doesn't mean that you're a cloak and dagger dude. And like the people from the Bureau, it really depends on what your job is. Now, some of the supervising agents from the Bureau have been involved in a lot of this kind of stuff, but I watched one of them that stuck with me was a shooting at Old Dominion, and they had the police outside. It was a tactical response by the law enforcement in the area, and they immediately went to one of their former FBI people who I was thinking, most of the time, first responders to these kinds of incidents is not the FBI. It's your regular old cops, all right? Police, sheriffs, all that kind of stuff. They're the ones that show up first. The people at the FBI don't necessarily jump up from their desks and run out and get in their black, I guess they're SUVs now, and hurtle themselves off to try and cordon off an area and do that. No, they do have some tactical teams, and we know that oftentimes there are various very serious people that they go after. We saw that during the Biden administration, where they were managed to surround the houses of elderly critics of the administration and execute with a lot of weaponry, body armor, stuff like that against people who were asleep in their home and had no criminal or violent history to speak of. So that sometimes happens. So when you're watching these characters, you really need to see if you're getting somebody that they're pulling in that might have some background in it, or if you're sitting there and thinking, I think I know as much about that as they do, maybe even more, depending on your personal experience, and try and sort that out. Poor Ted Williams, who's on Fox and was a former homicide detective in Washington, D.C., quite some time ago, really nice guy. They send him places all the time where he has no background in it at all. I mean, they had him, out in the desert. He's never probably driven across the desert, much less tried to hunt somebody down in the desert to figure something out. And the poor guy's out there, and so he's forced or reduced to saying things like, well, I think they're going to talk to people, and they're probably going to be questioning about their whereabouts, and, things where it just makes him sound like, okay, and they flew you out there to do this. And he doesn't look very happy about it either, because it's just out of his wheelhouse a little bit. He's got a lot of good things to say about things that he has some experience in, and I think he's a very thoughtful dude. But you gotta, if you want an expert, let's get an expert in what's actually happening. Now, of course, we have and this has been developing for a couple of decades, where the discussions are of people who are presenters, as the British like to call them, talking to each other. For the most part, how does that work? That used to be a joke, probably back in the 80s to the early 90s, about journalists interviewing themselves. Now we see it all the time. They get a panel together, and half the panel is the people who were reading the news the last hour. Now, they're welcome to their opinions, but I'm not exactly certain that their opinions are a lot more valuable than yours. Now, I don't know if they don't want to pay people to come on or what. That's been something I've heard from some of the networks, that they do find somebody and they use them a lot, and then all of a sudden the person says, look, I got to get paid for this or something. And then, no, we're not going to do that. So they use people that they already have. Victor Davis Hanson, of course, doesn't get paid. He's not a paid contributor to Fox, for instance, because he doesn't want to be. He doesn't want to be known as a paid contributor in that sense to them. But for the most part, you guys got to really look at the sources out there. I just say that because we're getting inundated with it lately, of experts that you wonder. Hi, folks. Thanks for sticking with me here through this last first segment where I complained loudly about the fact that we keep seeing people discuss things on television that we don't have any real idea if they know anything about it, and then the increasingly interesting use of each other as sources. Say, you were reading the news about this 5 minutes ago. Why don't we have you on a panel to discuss what you just read? Hmm. Yeah, that's how you find stuff out. Anyway, so I wanted to talk a little bit this segment, just jumping jumping these sort of topics a little bit, because I've been hearing this a lot too, so I decided to do a little research for us. Some of them are talking about twelvers in Iran. That pops up and it's, oh, that's a very dangerous kind of thing going. Yeah, it's a very strange and dangerous kind of thing in terms of philosophy. And I thought I'd give you a little background in it. What they're talking about is the 12th Imam. And that's part of the really more rooted in the Shia side. Remember, there's two sects mainly of Islam, Shia and Sunni. And it's more on the Shia side. And that's the official religion in Iran. Right? What they're going to say is that according to their doctrine, the great leader Muhammad al-Mahdi did not die. He was descended from Prophet Muhammad, I believe, through the Prophet's daughter, if I remember right. But he disappeared instead in the 9th century, and they call it the occultation. Now the believers hold that he's still alive, but he is hidden by God and will return at the end of history as what's known as the Mahdi. Now the Mahdi, if some of you watched enough movies, know that the Mahdi idea pops up in a couple of films, as the Mahdi is sort of a messianic figure who defeats injustice, establishes a just Islamic order. If you watched the old movie Khartoum with Laurence Olivier, played a Arab leader who believed himself to be the Mahdi, that eventually, historically, that Khartoum was finally overcome, and Pasha General Chinese Gordon, played by Charlton Heston, as I recall, was killed in that, and led to a lot of resulting problems in that area. But that's it. And so there's been people popping up periodically claiming to be the Mahdi, but so far it hasn't really happened. Now, after the 1979 Iranian Revolution, you may remember that, where they took people hostage in our embassy. Yeah, and that was led by this Ruhollah Khomeini. It's easy to get confused with Khomeini, but Khomeini was the guy that was living, as I recall right, in Europe, and was, after the Shah was deposed, was brought in, and I think with a wink and a nod from the Carter administration, who I think regretted that action later on, at least to some extent. And he was a big believer in this. And he had a little coda to this, where he said, since the 12th Imam is absent, Islamic jurists should rule in his place until he returns. So that's the sort of theological foundation of the Iranian state, is that until the 12th Imam returns, then jurists, who we would think of as clericals, like, I don't know, Khomeini, and Muhammad Ahmadinejad and people like that, they should essentially make the rules until the Mahdi turns. Well, until the 12th Imam returns. And so that gives them what they believe is some legitimacy there. Hey, we're just taking care of business until things happen. Now, practically, how makes some of these groups behave, and you have to understand this, they see that the regime then in Iran has some sacred legitimacy. It's a theocracy, of course. And they present themselves as governing on behalf of the hidden imam. It gives the state a powerful religious justification for all sorts of different stuff. And as part of their interpretation and some of the ideas surrounding the 12th Imam, there's a lot of apocalyptic stuff. Some factions frame regional conflict as part of a larger historical struggle, because the Mahdi's return is, depending on which interpretation you look at, happens after some very, very violent proxy warfare and so forth that goes on in the world. Now, if you are a fanatic, like, say, Hezbollah and their own Islamic Revolutionary Guard, and some of those others, and they are fanatics, by the way, they embed their ideas of why they're having to do what they're doing in the ideas of martyrdom, resistance, the sacred struggle, the thing we've seen back and forth in the Middle East for, I don't know, a very, very long time. Oh, a couple, probably 2,200 years, something like that. And so they think that if they precipitate sort of an apocalyptic ending to the world, which they think is going to happen, it's like sort of a bizarre take on the book of Revelations. When that happens, and they should do everything they can to make that happen, then the Mahdi, the 12th Imam, will return and straighten all this stuff out. Now, that's a pretty tough nut to crack if you're trying to do real politic with these people. It just doesn't work. And the Iranian sort of model is shaped strongly around some of the things that we associate, say, with, communist China, communist Russia, things like that. Secret police, extremely tight controls over everything, a strong border. Countries used to have that, so that they can keep things out they don't want. And then they make sure they sort of nip everything in the bud. This makes resistance very difficult. It's difficult to get it started because they literally have some very fanatical people roaming around who are quite capable of doing pretty much anything in furtherance of what they see as their cause. And this makes organizing any kind of resistance very difficult. And what happens is if you try, and by any reason you get found out, and it doesn't take much. I mean, they're another one of these countries, like some of the communist countries, like Cuba and places like that, where some of the sins that you can commit against the country are things like, undermining the leadership. One of them I think that they have is a fighting against God, which is to say that the judgment of these clerics should not be questioned by the likes of you folks out in the street, and if you get a little too serious about it, something bad's going to happen to you. And something bad happens to lots of people there because of that. So the heel is pretty heavy on the necks of these folks. And it's fairly clear that the United States had hoped, because of the dissatisfaction of the regime and how heavy-handed it's been, that if they could, quote, decapitate it and sort of free that up a little bit at the top, that, there'd be some sort of revolutionary arising. Like when they overthrew the Shah, who in retrospect was better than these guys. Yeah, but that's not the same. When the Shah had a fairly liberal Western democracy, I mean, there was a lot of, their own secret police and whatnot. But the idea of a revolutionary counterfront was much easier to foment then. Just like this in the United States, for instance. The kinds of things that you see protesting in the United States would, not happen, or certainly not happen more than once in places like Iran. So he got a lot of control for him, and the ruling clerics, they learned a lesson from that. If you're in charge, never ever stop being in charge. In daily life, everywhere. I mean, they have some of the more bizarre things, and this is just another sort of form of control at a societal level. That is like they have morality police. Now, a lot of the morality police do is just that. They prowl around the streets and try and find businesses that are not conducting themselves within Islamic principles. And they find them, close them, all sorts of things. And they also are interested in finding people out there who are not addressing their way of life as they interpret they should be. And a lot of it has to do with women and how they dress and where they go and what they say and all this other kind of stuff, because that's easy to see, all right? And they also make it very clear that if you help them out, that's a good thing. Collaboration is very helpful there. So if you think folks are really going to easily exist already and rise up against this regime, it's going to be very tough. It's a lot tougher than I think we thought it was. But what I wanted to finish up so before I went back is that if you don't have some sort of organized resistance that not only is fairly communicative with each other, but also not three or four that are competing, then you might be able to have something. And when we tell Iran, that's not the case. Anyway, I thought we would spend this third segment talking about something that also gets talked about a lot, but never any perspective. And I think it's pretty interesting, and I think you'll find it too. And that is, we hear about the Crusades all the time. All right? Oh, during the Crusades, or the Crusaders, or this or that. And we kind of have an idea about it, but it's probably something that would be better known if you want to understand the Middle East. And also, we were talking in the last segment about all this apocalyptic ideas that, some apocalypse will come up and the 12th Imam and all this kind of stuff. Look, the Middle East has had some pretty apocalyptic stuff going on in it for a long time. So defining any one as which is the one that's going to trigger something is kind of hard to do. I mean, when Americans hear about the Middle East, we often sound like it's something new or, modern or something like that. And it's not the case, of course. It's been a ground of which people have been fighting over for at least 2,000 years. I'd have to go back and figure out it exactly. And Jerusalem in particular, it has enormous symbolic weight. It's sacred to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And so it's a stage for where a lot of these conflicts sort of get framed, right? And, of course, the Crusades are sort of a great example of that. And they began in about the late 11th century. And they went on for about 200 years. Okay? During that time, armies from Western Europe repeatedly marched westward trying to seize or defend the Holy Land. Now, they also sailed across. One of the things that is interesting from a Western perspective is that while the various forces in the Middle East were pretty formidable, particularly under Saladin, who we'll talk about in a minute, they could not have mounted the same kind of offensive into Europe that the Europeans were able to mount in the Holy Land. It gives you some idea of the coordination within some of these armies from what we now think of as Great Britain, England at the time, France, Germany, a few Italians thrown in there, and various other folks that were able to put together a pretty large army and a lot of equipment and horses. Remember, these guys were riding horses that we're still not real sure exactly what the exact breed of horses are. And those of you that raise horses out there, probably know this. But the Middle Ages, the horses that the knights rode, deserters, my French is terrible, but were bred specifically for battle. And they were large, mean, and capable of sustaining pretty good speed with a lot of weight on their backs, and were very expensive. And after the age of knights and whatnot, the breed sort of disappeared, and there's speculation a lot about exactly what type of horses they were, and if some of the workhorses like Morgans and so forth are spin-offs of those at some point. It's all very interesting, and if you like horses, and they're great to see. They're so important in history. But anyway, so they're transporting their own. It's not like they went to the Middle East and bought horses. No, they brought their own. The horses that Saladin and people prior and after him in the Middle East were riding were, as we think of now, Arabians today, which many people raise, but they were very fleet, very beautiful horses, but they were not made to carry someone of European size in heavy armor, even when it was just chainmail and whatnot, especially for long distances and into battle, and especially in a charge where you're, leveling lances and so forth, where you want mass and bulk behind that. So they brought their horses, they brought themselves, they brought supplies, they of course brought weapons, servants, all sorts of stuff. You just don't show up, with a sword and start wading into people up there. It was a very sophisticated operation, really. And it was something that the West was able to do, but there was no chance of the people in the Middle East probably doing the same thing. They also didn't have the sort of shipbuilding and transportation knowledge that the West had. And so there's a whole long series of these various campaigns, and they began in the late 1000s. The Christian Roman Empire there at Constantinople kept losing territory to the Muslim powers, particularly the Seljuk Turks, who you may understand now as Turkey. Then the emperor there asked Western Europe for some help. And in 1095, Pope Urban II gave a speech at the Council of Clermont, urging Christians to travel east to reclaim Jerusalem and aid his fellow Christians. And as part of that, they said the participants were promised spiritual rewards and forgiveness of sins, which was a big deal for a lot of these people who were fairly devout, but not so good at avoiding sin. And the campaign carried sort of a strong apocalyptic overtone. You know, that this was the clash of the infidel against, well, they thought us were the infidel. This was the count of the barbarians against civilization and Christianity. And so they thought that taking Jerusalem, which had fallen into the hands of the Islamic people, at this point, it wasn't really Islam. It was the Islamic culture as we think of it now had not quite developed yet. That would be a little bit in the future. But also there's some practical motives. Land, wealth, and the chance to fight in what was framed as a holy cause and, of course, get your sins forgiven. Now, the speech that Urban given is quite interesting if you go back to it. And he said there was a large crowd of people. Remember, giving speeches, you could certainly do it, but it wasn't like, just endless windbags on television we have now. You kind of had to get people together, find a place that you were going to hold the thing and whatnot. And he also understood that at the time, there was all sorts of minor wars, kind of restless knights, nobles that were constantly fighting each other. So he thought that given the situation in the Holy Land, that would be a good idea to try and band everybody together, get them to march east, and reclaim Jerusalem. And so as he was discussing that, chroniclers of the time, and you'll hear this term, started shouting, Deus vult, which means God wills it in Latin. Now, we're not exactly sure if that's the way it happened, but it was very symbolic. So thousands of men literally sewed cloth crosses onto their clothing, and that's where the term crusade comes from, right? Crosses on their crusade, sewing the crosses on their clothing. Entire columns of knights then, peasants and adventurers from all over the place, began marching thousands of miles toward religion, and of course coming across in ships. Most of them had never even seen the Holy Land, which they referred to as Outrumer at the time, which means the outer land, the Holy Land. And they had no idea really where it was. They were just going to go there. This wasn't just a war. They were participating in a sacred turning point in history. So that was the first crusade, how it got started anyway. And the first crusade was probably the most successful because arriving there with all these knights from France, Germany, Italy, across the Mediterranean, it was a pretty brutal journey, by the way. Many people died of disease. This was often the case back then. There was some attacks on some Jewish communities because everyone was fired up with this ridiculous idea about the Jews, and too much religious zeal at that point. Now, eventually, these Crusader armies reach the Middle East, right? And they capture several key cities. And things are going pretty well for them. And part of it is because they hadn't ever seen anything like these knights before, right? They had never even seen someone in armor like this and on these huge horses. And the fighting style was so different. The fighting style amongst the folks in what we think of the Middle East now was a lot of hit-and-run tactics. A lot more archery was involved. They were lightly armored, very fast horses, And one of the things they were successful at is if they could cut some Europeans off from the main force and surround them, and just sort of like getting the wagons in a circle in an old Western, they would surround them and fire arrows into them for quite some time. Now, when it came to the knights themselves, if they were in armor, the arrows weren't quite as effective, certainly unless they were very close. But it did pick off everybody else. And one of the things that it did was, of course, it was pretty hard on the horses. So that was the tactic that got used against them. However, on the other hand, if they could get a fight, an open fight between the Crusaders and the armies in the Middle East from all these various tribes that were fighting at the time, a charge from armored knights on board these huge horses just would plow right through them. So it was sort of a tactical game where the Middle East folks would try and lure the Crusaders as they were marching into some place where they could cut them off from the larger body, surround them, and take them down that way in a way that they could not charge them and have an open battle. And, of course, that was exactly the opposite of what the Crusaders wanted to do. They wanted to force them into a situation where they were head-to-head because they knew that even though they were vastly outnumbered, they had the ability to slice right through these folks if they could get them lined up right. So if you're interested in military tactics, it's a really very interesting time. And because of that, they were really successful. Because remember, they didn't really know what hit them over there. And so they took Jerusalem, right? And that was a big deal. When they reached Jerusalem, they felt that they had reached a goal, right? And that was in and of itself something that was very important in the lexicon of the Crusades. The issue, of course, was that you got to hold it. Well, they established what were called the Crusader kingdoms at the time. And the Crusader kingdoms were just what they sound like. Various, I would say, various knights, nobles, especially people who were like second sons from a noble family, thought they could come there and make their fortune in the Crusades. They could get their sins forgiven. They could maybe see some land over there. When they took the city of Jerusalem, it was a very bloody battle. Both sides say that. I mean, medieval warfare was pretty brutal anyway, but the fall of Jerusalem was one of the more remembered and controversial moments of the Crusaders' era. They were very tough on the inhabitants of who resisted them in Jerusalem. After that, they did establish these Christian states, the Crusader kingdoms, and the important one, of course, being the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And this looks like a big, important triumph to the Europeans, but the folks living there felt like the Muslims felt like it was a shocking invasion, right? And from the far western edge of the known world, right? So, but that goes on, and they're successful for, we want to say another 30 or 40 years. And these cities, and rather these Crusader states, are surrounded by a lot of really powerful territories controlled by these other tribes. And in 1144, they captured the Crusader-held city of Edessa. Now, when that got back to Europe, they thought, oh no, things are now they're going wrong in the Holy Lands, right? So that triggered the Second Crusade. And the major European powers during that, there was France, Germany, I think Conrad of Germany, and others. It was very hastily put together, badly organized, and it just really failed. They had heavy losses, and they just really couldn't get their objectives done. And it psychologically was obviously pretty important because the Middle Eastern folks felt that, well, this shows that these guys are not as difficult as we thought from the First Crusade. We managed to hold them off. And so some time passes right after that, and you get the rise of somebody that many of us know, Saladin. Great leader. he organized a number of the disparate tribes in the area around Jerusalem and the Middle East into one fighting force. And so in the late 1100s, he was pretty much the man in the Middle East and was trying to push the remainder of the Crusader kingdoms out. And he had a terrible battle in terms of what happened to the Crusaders. It was called the Battle of Hattin, and it was very decisive. Lots of Europeans were killed. They did not really have anything like a good escape route if you want to study it. And afterwards, Saladin captured Jerusalem, and that, of course, shocks everybody again in Europe. And some of the most famous figures at this point show up in the Third Crusade. It's very interesting. The most famous you'll think about is Richard I, who we know as the Lionheart, the Coeur de Lion, the heart of the lion. And he had really an enormous amount of military skill. He was an enormously successful general, and also enormously effective in personal combat. He loved war, and he was good at it. Not a great king. He spent most of his time somewhere else, very little time in England. When he was in Europe, he spent it in what we would think of as parts of France, because remember, the kings of England at this time also had lands in France and so forth. And as a matter of fact, they spoke French in the English court, or what we think of as English court now. But he had a number of victories, but he could not take Jerusalem. And so after a lot of battles, there was a compromise that they had arrived at where Jerusalem was still held by the Mideast forces, but the pilgrims could show up in there, right? And that was thought to be, okay, fine. And that was as good as they got. And it was great sort of spectacle, and it generated a whole lot of interest from people, because you had the Lionheart on one side and Saladin, who was pictured even in the West as being an honorable figure and a great opponent, right? And who knows what would have happened if Richard would have stayed longer, but let's remember, things were going south for him in England, and he thought he had to get back. And the French and some of these other peoples had already left, so that was the deal. After that, you have a series of crusades, and they just gradually got weaker and weaker, right? And they're smaller, less organized. By 1291, the last Crusader stronghold had fallen in that, okay? And there were some really strange things that happened during this time, and one of them was the People's Crusade. Well, one of them was the Fourth Crusade. The Fourth Crusade started in Europe, and they were going to go down there. Well, they never got to the Holy Land. They got to Constantinople, and they thought, gosh, this is a rich city, and we're here with a big army. And even though these people are also Christians, they're not the same. There's the Western Orthodoxy and the Eastern Orthodoxy. So they thought it was kind of okay if they just kind of took a lot of stuff. Now, Constantinople was a hard nut to crack, so as we know for how long it stood up. So they tried to, and they did, in fact, in some instances, sack Constantinople, and it never made it to the Middle East. And I guess they were happy with that. But the one that really was a strange one that people occasionally will reference if you hear about it, it's called the People's Crusade. And the People's Crusade took place right around the First and Second Crusades. And it was very unexpected. And they thought only knights and fighters would do that, but preachers and wandering monks began repeating this call across villages and towns. And so people felt like this was a holy cause, and they should go too, even though they weren't necessarily warriors or had any of the equipment. And there was a guy called Peter the Hermit, who you may have heard about. And Peter rode from town to town on a donkey, and he preached that God wanted ordinary people, not just nobles, to go to the Holy Land and liberate it. Crowds treated him like a prophet, and then he gets this huge group of essentially ordinary citizens who don't really have arms or logistics or anything else to start marching with him out of Europe to the Holy Land. And it was a very chaotic march, right? They had no military organization, no anything like that. They traveled through Europe. Discipline broke down. Groups looted towns for supplies. And so what was happened was by the time they got to Constantinople at this point, which, of course, the Fourth Crusade hadn't happened yet, the Romans, Eastern Romans, didn't want anything to do with them. They saw this was terrible. Plus, they couldn't feed them. They don't do with them. And so he asked for the Western Europe, Alexis the First. I remember that now. Yeah, he was the emperor at that time, and asked for somebody to come straighten this out. And he got a few knights to come help, but not much. But he did ferry them across into the Middle East because he wanted to be rid of this group of people that he couldn't even feed. And once they were in the Middle East, in Anatolia there, they marched into territory controlled by the Seljuk Turks at that time, who were very fighters. And without any supply, scouting, military leadership, weaponry, they're quickly surrounded. And it was catastrophic. The Crusaders were, the People's Crusaders, overwhelmed. Thousands were killed. And then the survivors fed back to just exactly where the Constantinople people didn't want them, back there. And, of course, they had nothing because they didn't have much when they went through, which is why they tried to move them on. And when they came back after the rout, what was left of them, they really had nothing. And so it became very problematic. And the People's Crusade was a good example of people's ideas and faith getting ahead of logistics, which is what wins wars. It was very, very bloody, very sad. But that's the Crusades. And they went on, like I said, and then eventually they just sort of petered out. And less success as time went. And the Middle East always remembers that as an invasion. So that's why it keeps coming up with them.